Deacon Tom, good to see you. Happy Saturday.
Hey, good to see you too, Nicholas.
Thank you very much. And there's a lot to talk about. I'm curious about how you became a deacon and in your role. I know you're a minister in a hospital, right?
Right, correct. I'm the head chaplain at Cape Canaveral Hospital, and actually just was honored and blessed to become the first full-time salary chaplain for Health First for
Oh,
community hospitals.
wow, that's amazing.
So yeah, it's been I'm in my fourth year now, and it's just been an amazing journey.
That's awesome. So has that like been a career for you? Or is that something you just got into 4 years ago?
No, I was a social worker for 28 years prior to this. So I'm entering my fourth year as a hospital chaplain. I was a private practice social worker doing community-based case management for the developmentally disabled population. And, I honestly, it felt like it was winding down for me anyway because of all of the changes and regulations and an awful lot of red tape. And I was not really sure what was going to happen as far as I like doing field work. I like being out with clients. But what really made the thing all come to an end and this snap switch change into the vocation of a chaplain was COVID.
Hmm.
So during COVID-19, I had been in my first year of formation for the diaconate, which kind of parallels my vocation as a chaplain. The two make sense of each other for me. But I was kind of, I know I'm not the kind of person that can sit on his hands when things are happening. I don't mean to sound at all like a hero. I just can't sit and watch the news and watch bad things happen. So, and I was kind of, to be honest, scandalized by all of the churches that had kind of shut down during ministry with folks. And it's easy to play midnight quarterback, Monday morning quarterback rather, and judge what we know now versus what we did then. But I just felt like there wasn't a lot of courage. And I looked around to see who was still doing ministry, Nicholas. And hospital chaplains never stopped. So I said, all right, I'm going to go ahead and pursue that immediately. And that last year, as really the last 6 months as a social worker, they were paying us to do paperwork and to call clients who are developmentally disabled on the phone or a video, which they don't do well with generally as a population. But I got all my satisfaction by being an assistant chaplain at Holmes Regional Medical Center, which is a level 2 trauma center. And as I was leaving that first 6 months, I was in a program called Clinical Pastoral Ed. CPE teaches you how to be a hospital chaplain. It's the best formation program ever. And I think it was better than the pastoral part of the diaconate program formation program I was in. It's not a theology program, but it helps you help people pastorally in traumas. Just the best program ever. Anyway, I was finishing my first unit, and I was with sadness that I was telling my preceptor and my supervisor goodbye. That it looks like I'm back to doing social work and maybe heading into a parish. And he then told me that a job had just opened up at Cape Canaveral Hospital as the chaplain. That never ever happens. Just to make that clear, like how God was in that, Nicholas. It never happens that way. A chaplain, people move across the country to get a head chaplain job. They're very rare and they're very coveted. Really, I was basically a rescue dog, a stray with only one unit of CPE. But the circumstances around that were just amazing if you wanted me to get into it.
Well, I certainly do. And to add to your point, as far as it being rare, but I've never actually I didn't know that that kind of role would be reserved for a deacon. I thought like mainly priests would do that kind of thing. That's all I've ever heard about is you have you have a parish, maybe they have two or three priests, and one of them will be a pastor or a minister for the hospitals. I've never heard of a deacon doing that before, so that's even more interesting.
So yeah, sure. So and those are the good old days, the model you're talking about. We have the reality in all of our parishes where there aren't three priests, and you're some my particular parish has five deacons, But that's a rarity. Most of the time, you have one, or you're looking for a deacon. Um, Health First is not a faith-based hospital, so it's even more of an oddity than even all of that, because it's not a Catholic hospital system. It's not a faith hospital system of any kind. Whereas like Advent Health is a Seventh-day Adventist system. Health First is not. Yet they value pastoral care quite a bit. So it's kind of an interesting thing that they would at least have one chaplain in all of their hospitals at any given time.
And that's interesting. So they're not even a faith-based place, which means that if they do have a chaplain, it could probably just be anybody.
It could be anybody, and it always and it is a deacon in a hospital. If he's the chaplain or the head chaplain, as in my case at my hospital, you're basically the pastor of this large multi-faith community, which could be people from not just different non-Christian faiths, but no faith at all is more the common, is the norm. Um, and deacons aren't trained to be, at least not in my formation program. Deacons are not trained to be running anything. We lead the people in prayer, but we're servants.
Right.
So even that way, though, it made sense of the servant leadership model that diaconate is supposed to be in the way that I look at it. And I was getting heavy at the same time into formation, into diaconate formation, right in the midst of the COVID apocalypse. And the two of them just made sense of each other. Diaconate and chaplaincy, for me, make sense of each other.
That's amazing. So both of these came together right around the same time.
They did.
I'm curious as to what inspired you to become a deacon?
That's the kind of thing where, so a vocation like to holy orders is God speaking to you. He just speaks to you and tells you. You feel that you're not sure, and all of formation is a test of that calling. Is it really a calling to that? I don't know if I mentioned to you, but back in the 1980s, I was in formation for the Roman Catholic priesthood.
Oh, no, I didn't know.
I did right out of the Navy. I did a small stint in the Navy as a submarine sailor, and then after that went right into a Benedictine monastery for formation. It wasn't for the Benedictine order; it was for the Diocese of Richmond, and I actually spent 5 years studying for the priesthood.
Okay.
And so all of that formation, though, is trying to figure out what the calling God is speaking into your ears. And of course, that was a really tough time in the seminary, at least in the Roman Rite in the 1980s.
I can
It was,
imagine.
yeah, it was lots of confusion, lots of disorder, lots of questioning of church teachings, and I'm very vocal about that. I don't have any qualms about. I'm not a very political minded person, so I don't mind not pulling punches. The church had a lot of fixing up to do, which it did in the late 90s, of the seminary. So
Well, I think it's a reflection of inner self too. All these people running it, and you have to look at these people like what are these people that run seminaries and dioceses? What do they value ultimately? And
right,
that's how you're going to see how things are run. So, but you did 5 years after the Navy,
right.
and I guess
Uh,
sometime after that you dropped out, right?
right around the I tell people I made it to first theology twice. So the way it's broken up is you do, and it was rare. It's rare now, and it was getting rare at the time where I did college seminary, what in the old days was called minor seminary. So that was at St. Meinrad, and that was for 4 years. And then I did my first theology year at Mount St. Mary's in Emmitsburg, Maryland, and then left. I was in this tumultuous, I wouldn't call it an argument with God, but it was like, maybe it was, because I wanted to be in the seminary, but I was not feeling that I was called to be there anymore. And when you oppose God's will and He's working in your life that way, it can be a miserable fiasco. It can be a miserable experience because you just don't. You're in the wrong place. You're not where you're supposed to be, and you know it in your heart. So I left, and then I found I needed to serve God in some way, and felt that being a social worker, after working with kids with emotional problems for a few years in inpatient settings, this opportunity came up to be a social worker with a home and community based waiver, and I did that for 28 years and loved it, loved most of it. In the end, that I was sensing my time was not, you know, not, I wasn't supposed to stay there any longer. But to your question about the diaconate, Nicholas, when I look back at my time studying for the priesthood, I'm pretty good with academics. I'm pretty good with theology. I have the chops for it, but it wasn't the thing that made me happiest. What made me happiest was doing nursing home visits and doing uh, working prison ministry. And so I felt called to be serving in places. And God just does these amazing things when He wants you to. So the strangest things, we call them affirmations. All along the journey towards the diaconate, my wife had been saying for some time, you really should think about pursuing diaconate formation because I see it in your life. I see it for you. And of course, I was not. I had had a bad experience in the seminary, and I was not wanting to go back into that whole thing. But the weirdest things happen. When God wants you, He'll have you. And I would go, for example, I tell the story. I went one time about 2 years before finally agreeing to go to a discernment night. I had some jewelry. I don't remember what it was, but it wasn't even religious jewelry that my wife needed me to drop off at the jeweler to fix. And I brought it in, and there was a nice lady behind the counter. I was telling her what I needed. And as I left, she said, "Okay, have a good day, Deacon."
Oh,
Now, she didn't know me, and she had no possible idea. Strangest of things like that happen to you. And it's just, I've learned the hard way. It's just easier to do what God says. I mean, it's just a good idea.
did you ask her why she said that?
No, I was so shocked. It was one of those moments, and my son was with me, and we've talked about it in the years since. It's one of those moments like they're so bizarre. When you drive away, you walk away asking yourself, "Did that really just happen?"
Yeah. And
Um,
speaking about vocation too, I don't want to take the opportunity to miss. You mentioned it's a calling from God, and it absolutely is. And to that point is I'm assuming that sometime after you left the seminary, you obviously got married, which is a very important vocation.
right.
So
Yeah, absolutely.
the rest is
Um,
history on that. But yeah,
exactly. And marriage. If you're called to the married life, marriage actually helps you on your goal for salvation, and that is the purpose of it. Is to help each other get to heaven.
if I might add, that's how if it's done right, 100%. If it's not done right, well, then
Exactly.
who knows what could happen in that case.
No, you're right. And truth is that if it was done validly, a sacramental marriage bestows the graces, even if you get off to a rough start. Um, and I think, and it's that way for priesthood and diaconate as well. We can stand in the way of the sacraments. We can stand in the way of their grace, but the grace is there. It's real. Um, and so I know I wouldn't have. I personally would not have survived. I don't think I would have survived diaconate formation. God would have had to found another way
Right.
if I didn't have my wife's support and just her sober honesty, her clarity.
And that's a good thing to have when your spouse, who you're both trying to help each other get to heaven, says, "Hey, this path of the diaconate is going to help you get to heaven." Right? That's
Exactly.
another. That's basically like a mini vocation because your ultimate vocation, at least in my opinion, I could be wrong, but you're married. So I think that's number one, right? But then you have the second one is the diaconate, and third is the helping people, helping in your ministry.
I am so glad you went there, and I don't know if we've ever talked about that, but I have an actual. I'm kind of an outlier, and what you just said that that priority or that understanding of sacraments is what many people say, but I actually disagree.
Okay.
Your first calling is it happened in your baptism.
Sure. Sure.
Your first calling is to, well, and the people that were doing my formation, most of them agreed with what you had just said exactly. and not what I'm saying to you now. Um, your first calling was to Christ. Your first calling was to be an active priest of the believer of through your baptism. Um, Everything else has to come to me from that. And if it all is properly aligned, they just simply enhance each other. Um, where that's important is there were guys in formation that, you know, and it was a journey for them that was different than mine. They had to, the married clergy and the Roman Rite is a new thing, a new phenomenon. And one of my beefs is that we've never engaged in dialogue with our Eastern brothers in the Byzantine tradition who have been living that nonstop for 2 millennia. The Roman Rite has just brought the diaconate as a standalone order back since Vatican II and didn't operationalize it really until the 1970s. And we tended to listen more to our Protestant neighbors than we did to the Eastern Christian traditions, which is a shame because there's so much more to offer, I believe, in the Eastern Catholic tradition.
Right.
But there were plenty of guys, Nicholas, who struggled with, and their families and their wives, how are we gonna work this out? I'm never gonna see you. You're not gonna sit with me in the pews. Um, they have to be willing to give you to the church. And luckily my wife and I have a really solid marriage that, and it wasn't always, believe me, I after seminary I was we prayed some and drifted away from the church, so we ended up in our own wilderness. And yet the marriage survived, and it not only survived, but as we were realizing a whole lot was wrong in our life, we started going back to mass and started praying together. And it wasn't hardcore, it wasn't enough, but it was better than nothing. And when we lost my oldest son in a car accident in 2005, instead of getting away from God, instead of being mad at him, we grew closer. It actually, a lot of marriages break up after the death of a child, um, but ours got stronger, and that was just God doing that with that sacrament.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, Lord have mercy. I'm sorry to hear that. That's terrible.
yeah, I
We pray that
appreciate it.
he's in heaven. Yeah, that's oh my goodness, my heart goes out to him. But and to your point though, what you said I agree with, and it doesn't contradict what I said. I think I'm assuming a little bit here. Of course, your first call is what you said to baptism. But I think that okay, within that context, your call is to be a priest, right? In that sense of what you mentioned. But then
Yeah,
also too, you're a priest in your marriage. You know, you have that kind of sense of priesthood also within your marriage and in the other aspects of your life as well.
you're right.
That's
That's
how you
that
live it
is
out.
true.
Yeah.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I sort of when I get triggered and react that way. It's because I think there was a little bit of a strange emphasis on it in diaconate formation that the two should never be, because what can get missed is that the two should never be in conflict with each other.
Absolutely.
Um, and my wife, she's the director of Devereaux Children's Hospital's nursing program. She's the
Oh,
nurse manager, and so we both have busy, kind of intense jobs, and yet we're learned and gotten good at, okay, she needs space to decompress from a really rough day, or I need to grab a chotki or a rosary and curl up in bed and sort of just decompress from a really bad day, and give each other that space. And we were doing that already. So there
yeah.
was just this sense of, I really respect her vocation as a nurse, and she has seen a vocation in me to ordained ministry and has supported it that whole time. So there just was never a conflict. And I don't think it ever should be put that way. Like, you need to go on sabbatical because you're not paying enough attention to your marriage. No, those sacraments work together. What sacrament works against another sacrament?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a beautiful thing. So you guys are you and your wife are both kind of in the same setting doing different things, both in the
Yep.
hospital setting or nurse. She's a nurse, you're a
Yep.
chaplain, and so you can, I think, both understand each other on another level. Like, as you mentioned, at the end of the night, and you also mentioned, your wife giving you to the church. In my opinion, I think it's sort of a vocation for her as well because she has to live with you in your vocation, and so she also essentially takes that on as well in a way.
That's true. The deacon's wife. Yeah.
Yeah,
And again, in your tradition, in the Byzantine tradition, there is just a much more developed culture of that, and I think a healthy understanding of it.
how long was the diaconate program?
6 years.
6 years.
Yep, it's a 6 year formation program. You get a master's degree in theology. Um, yep.
Okay, so everybody that's a deacon, I see. I didn't know that. I thought it was maybe a year or two. So it's a whole 6 years. Is that the case for any diocese in the United States or just particular ones?
The minimum, I want to say the minimum by the USCCB, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, I want to say is 4 years.
Okay.
But almost all of them do it in six. And the reason is that deacons are supposed to be in the world, so we're supposed to be working, and to do we don't, at least in the Roman Rite, we don't, like, for example, stop our life and go to seminary for 3 years. I've recently learned, my understanding of the Byzantine tradition is they go to seminary, the same classes that priests do. So it's a different concept, really, where diaconate is a separate order in the Eastern Rite than the priesthood as well, but you're formed the same way. So that if the bishop calls you to be a priest because he sees that you have that vocation, you're ready to go, and he simply ordains you as a priest. It's less of a, it's a whole different way. It's a more, I don't know, that's, I want to pull that back. It's not a whole different way. It's definitely a different take on the difference between diaconate, the deacon and the priest.
Absolutely. That's it. That's interesting. So I didn't know that. That's amazing. So essentially, everybody that's a deacon, because you're right, most of them are married, have jobs, but at least they have 4 years of dedication and theology and everything else that
Right.
comes. And that they didn't just like walk and do it after a year or two. They were committed to it after 4 or 6 years of training.
Correct.
That's interesting.
And the Diocese of Orlando stretches it out to 6 years. And what you get with that is you're going to really know that candidate, and you're going to get to see them over 6 years and evaluate them. And it's a little bit more doable to get the master's degree. You're doing two programs at once. I did three. I'll explain. You're doing two at one time at a minimum, where you're getting your academics to be able to, you're studying theology and scripture. I mean, it's a full formation program. And you're getting pastoral training, learning how to not just do the liturgy, but how to minister to people, how to be the model of diaconate, that diaconate is model of service. But I added a third program to that just simply because of my history, as I mentioned, my entry into being a hospital chaplain, and it's called CPE, or Clinical Pastoral Ed. Just the best formation program for what it is, pastoral formation, head and shoulders above any other formation program I've been in for pastoral ministry. You learn how to minister to people in critical situations, in trauma.
Yeah, it's very
Um,
tough.
and so, yeah, and you have 4 units of that. And Health First actually spent 32 grand on me,
Wow.
with scholarships, training. Each unit's about $7,000, and they run a semester, and they put you in a level 2 trauma center or above, an ICU. You have a couple of other regular floors as well, and they put you in there to do whatever happened, to be a chaplain in the context of whatever is going on. It's sort of being like thrown into the deep end, but you come back, and it's the action, reflection, action model, where you come back and you process with your class what happened that day. You do ministry reports, verbatims, where you do a transcript of what happened and what you did and what you said, and then the whole class analyzes it and gives you pointers on maybe areas you could get better, or give suggestions on models. So all guided by experienced chaplains. It's simply the best program, the best formation program I've ever encountered.
Well, that's cool.
After that experience, I could do ministry anywhere.
I have to ask about that program, or just about any
Yeah,
of your any of your studies relating to being a minister here in the hospital. I mean, when I think about it, right, you're dealing with trauma patients. You're probably witnessing people that are like about to die or basically may die in your presence, and so that alone could be traumatizing to you. So, is there ways that is there anything that you learned how to cope with that, because that could wear on somebody over time as well?
absolutely. And that's a great question, Nicholas. That is one of the main points of the program is to teach you how within your own faith tradition how you can heal. What are your sources of strength, and how do you cope with this? Now, I'll throw out a real quick um, additional piece of information, sort of a clarifiers. There tends to be specialties within chaplaincy. There are police chaplains, there are hospice chaplains, there are trauma critical care chaplains, which is what I gravitated towards. These are sort of vocations within vocations. It's not like I chose or wanted that, or it was what I was built for. And you kind of know it because you try different kinds of chaplaincy. And some people find that they're not a trauma chaplain, or they're not they're meant to be in hospice. Um, so one of the things you learn is one of the first things I had to learn was how much is in my tank, for one thing. Like, I've just been through, I'll maybe see 25, 30, 40 patients in a day. Maybe 4 or 5 of them on ICU. They've been, maybe they're gunshot wounds, gunshot victims, motorcycle accidents, um, burn victims. And so you learn, okay, what is in my tank? Can I go into one more room? And to not go into one more room until you actually are recovered and healed. And you learn it the hard way, Nicholas. Like, I had to learn that because I wanted to see a lot of patients. And I would I would be at a door of a room after being in a deep patient situation and think, all right, I have a little bit more in me. But the patient in that room didn't have a little bit that they needed help with. They had a lot. And so those are your worst chaplain encounters, your worst ministry encounters. And so you learn that. You learn, like, techniques and everybody's different. For me, if it's a really horrible thing, I will go to my office. The chaplain's office is critical as a tool, and shut the door and shut the blinds and turn off the lights. And maybe I need to cry it out.
Yeah.
Maybe I've just been there where a kid has died. Mom asked me to do an emergency baptism, and I mean, not to be dramatic. I mean, I hold dead children,
Yeah.
and so after that, you go again, and you have it intellectually in your head, but you go and you start doing your report and you're typing, and you notice that your face is leaking. Um, you're crying. You say, all right, am I going to hold on to this, or am I just going to let it
Yeah.
out? And I'm a big fan of letting it out.
Yeah, well, you have to, because when you go into that next room, I think from a patient standpoint, you have to act as if nothing happened before. You have to be ready and 100% attentive to that patient's needs,
That's correct.
right? You
Yeah, you
can't.
have to be a good listener and a presence. And so part of that is you're absorbing their story. When I listen to your story or anybody's story, you then become part of my story. I will say that the Chotki and the Jesus prayer absolutely are sources of survival for me. Like, they help me heal. So, and I may need to do 100 of those, but that practice, Nicholas, grounds me and exposes me into God's grace, which heals me. It truly, truly does. Um,
And you can hopefully take solace in, if you've seen somebody that just died, like a little baby or something, praying to God and trusting in His mercy for them too.
yeah, you sure do. You do. The sad situations in a hospital setting are people with no faith. My saddest encounters are with people who die with no faith at all. I feel like I'm standing at the door of an abyss. For one thing, the true story. This is just the way it is. People who die with faith have very different kinds of death. than people who die without faith. Now, let me explain. It's always sad. It might even be traumatic, but there is really a sense of understanding when somebody that has faith and the family has faith is there's an understanding and a meaning to that that is absent if somebody lived their life without any faith at all. There's less drama most of the time. There's sadness, but there's a tension in the room when there are people who are in a place that are, they're confused, they've drifted away, or they never got good formation. They just they were at a weak place in their life when this tragedy happened to their loved one, to their brother or their sister. And so the existential angst of what the heck, what kind of God would let this happen? And they're going into a black hole. I have no idea where they're going. I have no idea. This is it though, but they're dying. It is like arguing with the angel of death. It is like dealing with the 800-pound gorilla in the room, because death is the ultimate equalizer and often a messenger that I will use to teach faith. I don't think you're arguing with me. I think you're arguing. I'm almost ready to let you argue with God, because this isn't something I did. Now, that being said, I have been very much open to, and I let people, when you walk into the room as a chaplain and you look like one, let them have their anger at God. I don't argue back with them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't say any of those things like, well, I'm going to let you argue with God. No, you'll walk into a room and someone will say, you and your God. And then it gets worse after that. They need to do that. We have to be big enough that we let them shout at God. And personally, some of my best prayer time with God in my history, some of it has been my angry talk with God. He can handle that.
Yeah, and letting those people, giving grace to those people as well while they're in that situation.
Sure, you're not yelling back at them. You're letting them get it out. They need to. Um, but you get grounded in certain practices that help you do this. And if God calls you, the fundamental thing, the theological thing behind it is, if God is going to ask you to do something, he will give you the grace to do it. And that might be, I don't mean to sound Hallmark, that might be that he gives you, he throws practices at your way, like you need to be praying the Chotki, you need to be praying the Rosary. That's a lifeline for you. Another thing, and I know I'm talking a lot, but that's what you do in podcasts, right? When I deployed to Fort Myers Beach after Hurricane Ian, Roman clerics are obliged. We promise to pray the Liturgy of the Hours, the Divine Office, and it's a book, with psalms and prayers. And I deployed to Fort Myers Beach with the first team on the ground after Hurricane Ian devastated the island. There were only 4 survivors. Most people don't know that of the whole island. How many were actually killed? I don't know, but it was more than the news reported. We were still recovering bodies when I got there.
Like a lot of bodies, or just like a couple?
A lot of bodies, a couple.
Couple.
I mean, in my direct vision of what I saw and what I smelled and what I experienced, and it wasn't a place. It was it was an interesting experience. In prayer, the only thing I could pray there was the Chotki, the Jesus prayer, and the Rosary. Those were the only 2 things I could pray. And you're in a rough environment where you're sleeping in our case, we slept in the Emergency Operations Center before we daily deployed out beachside. But it was difficult to sleep. It was a 7-day deployment, and it seemed like 7 months. But you have to find a way to keep yourself in connection to God, filled with as much grace as you can. And the only way to do that is prayer. And so you have to have something. The Chotki was what I prayed myself to sleep with every single night, the Jesus prayer.
Yeah. Well, thank God for that prayer.
And that was God.
Yeah. I mean, I can imagine the destruction. I mean, of course, we've all heard about it, but you actually were there for 7 days right after that. I mean, that's incredible.
And what we're doing now, the kind of things, that this is a neat thing that you do with these podcasts. What we're doing now is healing. So the thing that what a chaplain really does is you get people to start talking.
Yeah,
What's the crisis? What's happening? And not let you be alone in your misery and pain or suffering or whatever you're experiencing. Um, it is healing to us. God created us to be on this journey together.
absolutely. I mean, amen to that. Any final thoughts for this one?
I always when I talk whenever I'm entering into an encounter with somebody, um, and they're struggling with things, I want them to know it's important for us to let people know that we actually care about them, that their eternity matters to us, and that their presence is important and not insignificant. And I don't tend to ever like argue theology. I just want to know how you're praying, and I always love getting there as soon as I can. Tell me about your prayer because you matter.
Definitely, yeah, 100%. You have to; those people have to be reassured that you have their prayers, you have their back, especially in those tense situations they're in.
And I'll leave you with one final thought. You have to know what you believe. In any If you're going to go into any kind of a high stress situation, you need to be grounded in good theology and good prayer practices, which is why I really insist that formation programs be teaching the orthodox truth and not some novelty, because it's only the truth that will sustain you. You need to know who you are and what you believe before you work with others who have no idea what they believe.
Absolutely. Well, and I appreciate you. I appreciate you heeding your call to your ministry there as a chaplain. That's a very obviously tough one to be in. So thank you very much for that, and I'll pray for you. And
Thank you
thanks for
so much.
sharing your that part of your story.
Oh, it's a privilege. Thank you for letting me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Likewise, and hope you have a great afternoon, Deacon.
All right. God bless you, Nicholas.
Take care.
All right.